Hello and welcome to the latest in this series of live webinars from Tes. I'm Simon Locke, and over the last week or so we've been meeting some of our contributors, some education experts, and we've been unpicking some of the big issues in education at the moment. If you're new to this, you've missed out on a couple of crackers from Professor Tamsin Ford, who was talking about child and adolescent mental health and the sort of experience people might be going through now. We've also had Carol Henderson from Grief Recovery. She joined us on Monday to talk about supporting pupils and staff with grief. And coming up next week, we've got Mark Enser, who's looking at closing the learning gap that might be left by lockdown. And we've also got Gerard Cooney-Horvath, who will be talking about memory. And some myths, some facts, and the research behind it all. So tune in for those. If you want to check out the full schedule, you can go over to tes.com/Vodagogy. And if you want to ask any of our guests any questions, including our guest today, you can go over to Twitter, use the hashtag Tes Vodagogy, or you can jump on the comment section below, which leads me to our guest today. At the end of March, the UK was just entering its own sort of lockdown period, but lots of the world had already been locked down for a long time. Jennie Devine in northern Italy had already been experiencing lockdown for about a month or so, and she got in touch with us and offered to write about her experiences. And the article did really well. It's one of our biggest stories of the year so far. She shared her kind of personal experiences of what she's gone through about 4 weeks ahead of us here in the UK. Jennie, thanks for joining me today. Oh, I've got your mute. I knew I'd do this. Hi, Jennie. Sorry, try that one again.
Hi, Simon. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Lovely
to have you. Sorry, yeah, hopefully the last of our technical problems. We've been pretty good so far, touch wood. So yeah, Jennie, you're about 50 miles or so outside Milan, if I'm right in saying that. Talk to me about life. What was your life like before all this? I mean, where you tell me you live near some sort of rice fields. It sounds pretty idyllic. What was life like for you before the pandemic?
Before the pandemic, it was a pretty nice mix of traveling into Milan every day for work. It's about 45 minutes, an hour, depending on when you hit traffic. So a ride in, a long work day, coming home. I had the best of both worlds. You know, I was working in Milan, so I could stay and have an aperitivo or go to the museums and have all the cultural aspects. But I also had in my home life, there was, as you say, there's the rice fields. I live in the country, so it was a kind of a decompression, let's say, from the hectic Milan life. Yeah.
And then at what point did things start to change for you, and talk us through that period when you started to realize that life was going to be very different?
Well, it's actually on a Friday morning. I was driving into work with a colleague, and her husband's phoned in the middle of our drive saying that a case of this COVID had been discovered in northern Italy. And at the time, it just sort of seemed like a slightly melodramatic action to call somebody on the way to work about this. And then by the time the Monday came around, the schools in Italy, in northern Italy, were going to be closed. So it was a very quick turnaround. And I think that initially, obviously, it was just about 16-hour days, just trying to get the online learning going. But in terms of actual restrictions, initially, there weren't that many. Schools were one of the first things to close. So, you know, most of the shops were still open. We had to keep a meter's distance, some very odd rules, but then things just started getting the little range that you were allowed to go in started getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until for the last month or so, we've been basically told to stay in our houses. You're allowed 200 meters outside of the house for exercise, but everything else was just to go to the shops, go to a pharmacy, or emergency veterinary care. So.
Wow. Okay. And how have you sort of coped with that up until now? What's your sort of sense of it all at this point? Are you getting fatigued? Are you ready for a release?
I'm lucky because I live in the country, so I have a little bit of access to outside, and also because I live in a small town, it's more restrictive in terms of, there aren't that many amenities. There's one shop, but I also don't necessarily have the same sense of absence that people in Milan do. I think that they're seeing empty streets and they're hearing constant ambulances, so it doesn't feel it doesn't feel as relentless here. I have to say, I feel it does feel a little bit surreal in that sense, but for the most part, I think that I found a reasonable groove, and I am tired, but I think that I think everybody is,
Sure, of course. So for us in the UK, Northern Italy was sort of held up as almost the epicenter of the pandemic for some time. Did you have a sense of that during the course of the closures and lockdown, or was it, being in the center, did you not realize so much?
Well, I think that in terms of my actual personal experience, it didn't really seem to hit home until I was talking to, colleagues who were from living in places that were much more hard hit, or speaking to my, talking to my SMT and hearing the sirens go by when they're speaking because they live in Milan, or talking to other colleagues, and they have more experience with that. They maybe have the children, or you hear about a child in a class that maybe is touched by the coronavirus. So from my personal experience, it was more just kind of filtered through the members of our community, and that's where it really starts to impact and really starts to hit home.
So when it comes to teaching, how have you coped? How's your school coped? Your staff? I mean, you're a veteran at this now, compared to us in the UK. You must be getting the hang of it. What's it been like for you?
I think initially it was incredibly difficult, obviously, because there was such a steep learning curve. And not just in terms of technology, but in terms of the actual, what does online teaching look like? What does online didactic look like? That was a real challenge for us. So there was a few hurdles. The first was platform and getting to grips with the actual technology, but then what does the content of an online lesson look like? You can't just pick up a planning or your kind of your go-to lessons and just deliver them. So it was a real balance between we spent a lot of time, like 16-hour days most teachers were spending to begin with, just to get to grips with first the technology and then to understand what online teaching looks like. I think that one thing I realized quickly, I think all the teachers did realize quite quickly, was first of all, that's not sustainable. And secondly, I think my first lesson that I did I teach maths as well. The first lesson had Google Forms and quizzes and YouTube videos, but I realized that was overwhelming for the students to try to keep up with, and actually, sort of less is more, and we realized that quickly too.
Sure. So do you think this experience has changed the way you approach teaching? Do you think there's going to be things you take on from this into sort of post-lockdown life?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I found really interesting is the staff made a massive leap in terms of what they were able to learn, and all this hard work felt like it was really going towards something. This is a huge project, and there's a real sense of purpose. And I think that one thing that's really been interesting that way is just to see that teaching has a massive purpose, and oftentimes we don't realize that. We get sort of buried down in feedback and giving feedback and doing tracking and doing assessments and parents meetings and ticking all the little boxes, that we sometimes forget to put our heads up and think, what is it we're doing? And I'm not just talking about a school vision or an action plan. I mean, the purpose of education, the absolute it's a huge responsibility, but it's an absolute, it's a wonderful thing that we have this purpose to educate children. So I think that I think that that's one thing I want to do. I want to keep my eye more on the real meaning of what we're doing and the teaching. And the other thing I want to do is I will be more humble in the future. I like to plan. I like to organize. I like to have a, if this, then this. But sometimes, you have to just, things get shaken up and you have to respond. So
yeah. Do you think it's had an effect on the sort of relationship you have with, firstly, your staff and also your pupils? I mean, it's been imagine a huge shift in how you communicate, sorts of things you talk about, probably. How's that going to affect things going forward?
Well, I think one of the biggest things I found difficult with the staff is during the school day, with staff and with students, there's a lot of micro interactions, a quick smile, you have somebody will stop by, you run into somebody, you'll have a chat. There's a lot of social interaction that isn't necessarily for a purpose. I think that we've lost a lot of that, and it's really hard to, how do you duplicate that? How do I duplicate somebody, me running into somebody at the same time at the coffee machine and having a chat about, oh, by the way, I noticed this, or this student is feeling a little bit sad, can you maybe pop in? All those micro interactions are gone, and there is no way to really duplicate them online, because every connection that we have now is intentional. Somebody has to make an appointment to have an online call, or they have to send me a message, they have to write an email, and everything feels a little bit more formal. And I do worry sometimes that puts up a bit of a wall. So I've been really conscious about saying to people, please use please use WhatsApp, please drop me a voice message, please call me whenever. These are interactions that we wouldn't necessarily have had, but we need to try to find those, how do we duplicate those interactions? And in terms of the students, I think that I didn't realize before maybe the importance of the social structure and the social interactions for them. I mean, again, we focus on the education side of things, but we sometimes forget that, for those students, that smile, me saying their name, saying, hello, and saying their name, that matters. And I think that I won't take those things for granted, and I don't think the students will either.
You mentioned purpose there. Do you think, well, I know that a lot of parents in this country, and I'm sure across the world now, probably have more of an understanding of the role that teachers perform and how vital it is. But do you think it's changed the way you think about your role as principal and perhaps your school's role in the community?
Yes, I think that one thing that I think it's our job as leaders and as teachers is to bring the conversation to the emotional. I think that that's something that we wouldn't necessarily be highlighting. We've all been through a trauma, for varying degrees. Everybody who's going through this lockdown has gone through some sort of a trauma. And we need to give each other, as a leader, I need to give my staff permission to say, look, you are allowed to feel grief because you miss your children, you miss your class. You're allowed to feel overwhelmed because we're doing a whole new type of didactic program. You're allowed to feel that you're in the front line, and that people are directing, families are directing fear or concern at you. So I think that giving people that permission to have that emotional conversation is incredibly important. I need to do that for the staff, and the staff we need to put a space for that to speak to the children as well, and also be there for the parents as well, because again, this is a community, this is a world trauma that we're going through together. So that's how I see my role, a big step going forward.
Yeah, sure. So is there anything that's come out of this whole experience that you're sort of just ahead of us in, that's particularly surprised you? Are there any things that have, that you didn't see coming? I'm sure there's certain things that we can anticipate, but are there any sort of silver linings that you hadn't thought of before?
Yeah, I think that I think that realizing just how those social interactions and how important they are. I think that's a silver lining, because it means that we aren't going to take that for granted. I think that also in terms of coping, you have to put boundaries on your time, because your house is your office, is your school, is, they're all the same thing. And I think that's an important lesson going forward. And I hope that, I think that's something I want my teachers to do going forward as well. One thing, the things that surprised me are just how quickly everybody just pulled together. And even the people who, again, were a little bit leery of computers, everybody's pulled together. And my students and my staff continue to amaze me at how well they've coped to this, dealing with their own home lives as well and their own situations. And the students, they inspire me, because I think that just watching them, and when you see them and you can see they're still the same curious and creative and happy children who want to learn, that's been really something. I knew that they were fantastic, but I didn't realize just.
Has the work-life balance thing been a bit of an issue? I know from my own experience, it's difficult. There's a sort of blurred edge between work and not working at the moment. And I'm sure that's the same for everyone, especially those who are looking after children. It must be very difficult. Do you think that's made you rethink those boundaries and the work-life balance?
Yeah, it has. It's made me it's made me realize that not only is that something I need to be more conscious of. I think that as teachers, our culture tends to be, there's almost there can be almost competitive. Well, I stayed up till 11 o'clock doing marking. Well, I did labels and they color coded everything, and I was up at midnight. And there's almost a kind of competitive sense of there can be that kind of almost competition at how hard you're working. And I think that we have to change that culture, and we have to. I love this job, and this job is an important part of my life, but this job can't be our life. We have to realize we do have life outside of this. We need to make time for that. And if the job is, we need to make sure that the job can fit into our lives, not our lives need to be tailored around the job. And I think that that's something I want to encourage teachers to do. And if you're spending, but it's not just coming from me, of course, it comes from the government, it comes from expectations, it comes from Ofsted, it comes from, there's a lot of expectations put on teachers as well to do a lot of, to work hard, to be perfect, to tick every box. And I think that we do need to realize that we are people, and the more we allow ourselves to be human, the more we allow ourselves to go away, stop, turn off, the more we can come back with fresh ideas and with a new with enthusiasm instead of burning out.
Yeah, sure. So I don't want to jump the gun here, but I assume you've got half an eye on returning to the classroom at some point and some level of normality. Are you starting to think about that now in terms of changes you might have to make, curriculum delivery and those sorts of things?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is one thing at the moment is that we are able to see the examples of other schools around the world opening up, and I think that will be useful when we go back. I think that right now it's a little bit early, just because Italy will have to, whatever the school looks like in September, will have to be. We'll have to take into consideration Italian government guidelines. We'll have to take in, Lombardia guidelines. We'll want to see best practice from other schools around the world. So, I mean, of course, you have to, there are questions, and students start to ask, well, what is September going to look like? What are we going to be doing? And parents are wondering, and teachers wonder as well. But I think at the moment it's too early to make any firm calls on that.
Sure. Do you think your staff will have a kind of important role in terms of supporting, like you mentioned, parents as well as pupils, as Northern Italy kind of recovers from this?
Interesting question. I think that the way we can support parents is, I think that being as clear as we can in communication. And the problem with this situation is there's no right answer. Because every single person is living, every single family is living a different reality. There's no one size fits all, so there's no right answer. But I think that the staff, what what I would like them to do is just be able to support parents and just by communication, by listening, and by providing clear answers, and just being, sometimes you just have to listen. Sometimes you just have to hear what somebody's concerns are, and sometimes you have to hear below the first message, and you have to understand what the concern really is and try to get to the bottom of that. So I think that that's the way we can support parents.
Yeah, definitely. I've just got a few questions coming in from Twitter here. I'll jump on this first one. You said you wanted to keep an eye on your real purpose, the purpose of teaching. Do you see yourself treating holidays for your students differently in the future? I.e., will you give them a sort of complete break, or will you expect them to kind of be working during those?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, I think that we definitely need to take into consideration what the home life is a bit more and what the reality is a bit more. I think we've always been trying to be conscious of, if we are giving any homework, to make it something that's a little bit more, families can do it together. Families can, it's maybe a little bit more of a rich task as opposed to a series of worksheets. But I think that that's something that definitely would be, though we already try to do that, I think that that's a level that we have to go even further. I think that's a really good question. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess a similar thing goes for your staff. Do you think this sort of thing might put well-being into more sharper focus?
I hope so. I think that we need to have more conversations about it. And I think that one thing I want staff to do is socialize more. And I think that, I don't mean socialize outside, but we need to have, they need to be able to socialize in terms of just have those little conversations. It needs to be okay. And staff need to also be allowed to be imperfect. And they need to feel that they can be imperfect. And so I think that well-being absolutely has to be something that comes out of this, and the importance of staff well-being absolutely has to come out of this.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something that probably parents are going through at the moment. This fear that they're not doing enough in terms of homeschooling and those sorts of things, for sure. Another question that's come in from Twitter: Are you putting any plans in place in case this happens again? Not necessarily a sort of second wave, but has this made you rethink contingency plans in terms of remote teaching, that sort of thing?
Well, the good thing is, because the good thing is because we've had this experience, we have at least a basis to work from if something like this happens again. I mean, it's very different to reinstate something that you've already done, or rather than start it from scratch. So I think that, depending on what next year looks like, it could be that there's also an online component. I mean, in different schools and different places, there is an online component alongside a return to school. So I think that we would be looking at using the same model that we're doing, but maybe. Yeah, but yeah, we kind of have that in our back pocket, as it were.
Yeah. How have you found the remote learning? You say you teach maths. You teach another subject as well, I think.
No, I just teach maths for year 5.
Maths, is it? Yeah. How have you found that, adapting to that sort of scenario?
Again, initially it was really it was very, I wanted all bells and whistles, but I actually found that it's responding to what the children need, and children will really surprise you, because some children that in class might get distracted, might find things really difficult in their own house, in their own at their own table. They can be really quite focused, and so I've seen some really good some students who in class might be distractible, might not be able to put that same attention and focus. They've really been able to do that. So I think that the online learning has been, it's a challenge, it's of course it is. And, and in Italy, it's a little bit different from the UK, because we're a country where the children will come up and give you a hug, or, and you're used to those interactions, and they are used to giving those interactions. And so seeing them on the screen, they keep giving me virtual hugs.
Oh.
It does lose something, but but it's been interesting. And I don't by any means pretend that even though I've been trying to refine my practice and trying to get, use use Google Classroom and try to use all the programs to the best of my ability. I don't by any means pretend that I'm at the limit of what I could do and how I could improve, but we've also been in our staff, and we have other schools in Italy that we're in touch with. We've been sharing good practice there, and that's been a real help as well, because no one's an expert at this situation, to be honest. So,
sure. One question coming from YouTube. How have you communicated with parents through this process? What's your method of communication been?
Well, we send newsletters with photos, we send communications with schedules and timetables and meetings with parents. I've phoned parents, and these are individual parents. I've had class rep meetings, and I would normally have class rep meetings with an agenda or with something to discuss, and now it's more kind of like, let's meet weekly, but not necessarily with an agenda or with a point, but at least open up the space. So we've tried to put in some new ways of just communication as well, because it's not the same with staff. Those quick interactions, quick interaction in the garden, just checking in with parents. You have to sort of figure out a way to duplicate them somehow.
Yeah, is there any sort of advice you'd give to perhaps teachers out there who are struggling with engagement from parents at this time? Is there anything you've done that's been particularly successful?
I think reach out to the parents, because the lack of engagement might not be due to anything other than logistical issues, and it might be that they just need a pointing in the right direction of saying, like, it's okay if you turn in things late, or here's some resources, I can give those to you, or that lack of engagement can just become for parents who are overwhelmed, and they maybe can't look after they're maybe working from home, doing smart working, so they can't necessarily follow their children. And maybe what they need is for you to reach out and to say, hey, what are you struggling with? How can we help you? And how can we help bring your child back in? And the answer might be, they're overwhelmed. They can't do it. It's not practical. But at least if you've had that conversation, you're opening the door to find a way to invite the children in.
One more question that's come in. Are there any sort of techniques that you use personally to kind of stop from going mad, I guess? So you've been in lockdown for a little bit longer than we have.
Yeah.
I'm sure your days, like ours, are blurring into one at the moment. Are there any things that you do from a sort of well-being point of view that you might be able to share?
Yeah, I'm one for routines, and so I have my little routines. Like on work days, I do different routines than on my weekends. So on the work days, I make sure I get up at a certain time. I always go down and have my coffee outside, and I have I use a different cup on weekdays than on weekends. It's a small thing, but just those little ideas to kind of build in slightly different routines for each day. And I have on Sundays, I always watch a movie. You know what I mean? Just to kind of build in the kind of like fun routines that kind of distinguish different the days from each other. So and I also just read. It's also a really good chance. I try to look at positively. It's a chance for me to just to spend time reading and to not have to worry about all the events I'm not going to.
That's it. As soon as I get off this call, I'm ordering myself a weekend mug. I think I'm going to treat myself.
Yeah.
Is there another question that's come in from YouTube? Have you discussed with your staff about how you'll talk to your students about coronavirus when you return? Your primary age. So has that been discussed?
No, that's a really interesting point. We've kind of in the primary staff and early years of SMT, we've been talking about, how much do we need to speak to the children? How much information do we give the children? And, initially, we tailor things for the age, but basically we open up the spaces for the students to respond, and to sort of the way you would do after any sort of difficult event. You try to give the basic information, you try to keep try to keep fear, and you try to keep strong emotions out of it. You try to let the children know that they're everybody's doing everything they can to keep them safe, and to obviously talk to them about the procedures, but then open up space for them to talk, because I think that that's important. And even in my math lesson, you sometimes get children who will come on and maybe say something, and you might have to deal with an emotional, a slight take. You need to sometimes be a bit flexible about, it's not just about the objective right now. It's not just about getting through those objectives. It's okay, you've got your objective, you've got your curriculum, and you want to get through it. Of course, you have to, but there can be a 2-minute discussion where people are saying, "I'm fed up."
Nice. And finishing on a positive note, Jenny, what are you really looking forward to about returning to school?
I'm looking forward to just smiling at the kids and seeing them, and birthday cake. The kids always come with birthday cake, so I'm never going to get a birthday cake again. No, but it's. I think that I'll be happy to see that they've made it through. And I think that and I'll be happy to see them return to school, and that they'll have that stability again, because I think that's missing for them right now, the stability and the structure.
Great. Oh, that's great. Thanks very much, Jenny. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for joining us.
No problem at all. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Okay. As I mentioned, join us next week when we'll have Mark Enser, who is talking about closing the learning gap caused by lockdown for secondary students. And later in the week, we've got Jared Cooney Horvath, who is a neuroscientist, and he'll be talking to us about all things memory. So tune in for both of those. Thanks for joining us. If you're in the UK, enjoy the bank holiday weekend.